For many years now, I have been delivering a sermon on the Shabbat of Pesach in honor of my father, Rabbi Samuel Schafler, who died on the third day of Chol HaMoed Pesach. Although we cannot be in shul together this year, Rabbi Arnowitz was kind enough to allow me to give my talk by video so that we can keep this tradition alive. To say that we are living through extraordinary times would be an understatement. It feels as if the foundations of our world have shifted under our feet and forces of death and destruction have reemerged. It feels like an odd time then to celebrate Pesach as a joyous national holiday. But the story of Pesach has another element, another dimension, a cosmic significance that I had not fully appreciated until recently. It is this cosmic significance that I would like to talk about today. On a basic level, there's nothing particularly cosmic about the Pesach story. The story is about a particular people and their achievement of freedom from oppression so that they could freely practice their religion. That story is inspirational and of larger significance than just to the Jewish people. But it doesn't sound like a cosmic story. The cosmic story, in my mind, is the story of the creation of the world that we celebrate on Shabbat. That story celebrates the completion of God's work of creating an ordered world out of chaos, a world in which mankind could live. It turns out that Pesach tells a creation story too that closely parallels the creation story in Genesis in key respects. A number of scholars, most recently Shai Held, in a talk that he gave that was recorded on Facebook, noted the striking parallels between the two stories, the story of creation and the story of the Exodus from Egypt. For example, in chapter 1 of the Exodus, when Pharaoh schemes to enslave the children of Israel, he says, "Pen yirbu," lest they multiply. 2 verses later, the Torah says, "V'cha'asher ya'anu oto, Kain yirbeh," the more they were oppressed, the more they multiplied and increased. If you are familiar with the Hebrew, from Genesis you can hear the echo of the commandment of pru or vu, God's commandment to mankind to be fruitful and multiply. Later, in the second chapter of Exodus, despite Pharaoh's edict to the midwives to kill all of the Israelite males, Moses is born, and his mother looks at him, and what does she say? Vatera oto ki tovu. She saw that he was good. If you remember back in Exodus, when God creates different elements of the world in creation, he looks at his creation and it says, Vayar Elohim ki tov. God looks at his creation and he saw that it was good. And there are other parallels as well. For example, the plague of choshech, darkness, and the protective cloud that shielded the Israelites from the pursuing Egyptians are reminiscent of the separation of light and darkness in Genesis. The strong east wind, Ruach Kadim Azah, that blew over the Red Sea the night before it parted is reminiscent of Ruach Hashem, the Spirit of God that hovered over the waters in Genesis. And perhaps most striking of all, the horizontal separation of the waters of the Red Sea into walls of water on one side and the other, creating dry land in the middle, is reminiscent of the vertical separation of waters in Genesis to the heavens above and the sea below, creating dry land in between for mankind to live on. So it seems that these parallels are very striking. In fact, they are so striking that according to a midrash, when the Israelites crossed the Red Sea and they looked to the side of them, one side and the other, what did they see? They saw fruit trees. Now, why in the rabbinic mind would they have seen fruit trees? Because in Genesis, the next thing that happens after creation of dry land is what? It's the creation of fruit trees. And so to the rabbis, this is the next obvious thing that should happen in the Exodus if the Exodus is a recreation of the Genesis story. seems that the story of the Exodus consciously parallels the creation of the world. Or stated differently, you might say the Exodus is another creation story. How are we to make sense of this? It starts to make sense when you understand what creation is all about. To the biblical mind, unlike medieval philosophers, creation does not mean creating something from nothing, what the philosophers would call ex nihilo, but rather creating order from chaos. Genesis recounts God's victory over the forces of chaos in the natural world. Although you can see glimmers of this battle motif in Genesis, for example, the reference to tohu vavohu, that void, that uncontrolled void that pre-exists the creation of the world, it's even more explicitly expressed in Psalms and certain of the prophets, where the forces of chaos in the natural world are portrayed as a wild sea monster called Yam, which God vanquished so that the livable world, the world of dry land, could emerge. In a similar vein, Exodus represents God's victory over the forces of death and destruction in history, over tyrants such as Pharaoh, who seek to impose a regime of slavery and death to upend God's plans for a moral universe in which mankind can flourish. As Rabbi Held put it in his talk, Pharaoh is to history what the sea monster is to nature. Both are forces of chaos that must be defeated for God's plan for the world to be realized. Now, this answers two questions for me. One is, why does it say in the Kiddush on Shabbos, for example, that Shabbat is both Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, a remembrance of the words of the acts of creation, and also Zecher L'Tziat Mitzrayim, that it's also a memory of creation, of the Exodus from Egypt. What does Shabbos have to do with the Exodus from Egypt? On one level, you can say it's because we don't work on Shabbos, so we get a day off and we're not slaves in the way that the Jews were in Egypt. But at a deeper level, I think it's because Shabbat represents the idealized world in which both the blueprints for God's victory over nature and imposition of order in the moral world, in the world of history, are brought about. And so Shabbat, which represents this idealized vision, is both a remembrance of both creations, the creation of Genesis and the creation of Exodus. It also answers another question for me, which is why on Rosh Hashanah do we say, Hayom Harat Olam, today is the birthday of the world, or really the conception of the world. Hayom Ya'amid B'Mishpat Kol Yitzurei Olamim. This is the day we judge all creation. Why would we be judging all of creation on the birthday of the world? And the answer is, it seems to me, that God's conception of the world is not just order in the natural world, but in the moral world, in the historical world. And so we are measuring ourselves on that day as to how we are performing both in moral terms and in other terms. And this is a perfect time to be judging whether we as God's creatures are living up to the standards that God conceived at creation. Now, it is comforting to think that God defeated all the enemies of life once and for all at the time of creation in the Exodus, so that we can now live safely on dry land, so to speak. But unfortunately, we are frequently reminded that that is not the case. In reality, God's creation is precarious and continually threatened by forces that seek to undermine the ordered world. But unlike in the creation story in Genesis, when mankind was newborn, in Exodus, we're called upon to take a stand. To avoid the angel of death, the Israelites could not be merely passive bystanders. They had to opt in to God's plan by painting blood on their doorposts, identifying themselves as on God's side and against the tyrants of the world. Although we are now in a situation where we have to hunker down in our homes and stay safe from the virus that surrounds us. Ultimately, we too are called upon to join in the fight against the forces of chaos and death that threaten our world. The message of the Exodus is that we cannot be bystanders in the continuing battle of creation. We must become God's agent in the fight to bring about and sustain an ordered world, both in the physical and moral domains, so that God's blueprint for creation can be fully achieved. And then we hope to be able to say, in the words of the prophet Zechariah, Bayom hahu yiyeh Adonai echad, ushmo echad. In that day, God will be one and his name will be one. I wish you all a safe and sweet Pesach.